Deep within the wild and mysterious Carpathian mountains of modern-day Romania, nestled upon a series of hillsides, lie the ruins of an ancient metropolis that reached its heyday nearly 2,000 years ago. Its name was Scițyans, and it was built not by the Romans, nor the Celts, but another people, distinct in culture from both neighbouring peoples. They were called the Dacians, and it's from this great mountain stronghold citadel that their last and greatest king masterminded his wars against the Romans, not once, not twice, but on 3 separate occasions. His name was Decebalus, and out of all of the kings and rulers who fought against the Romans during their long history, Decebalus did so during a time when Rome was at the very apex of its power, during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. It was a time when the empire's borders stretched from modern-day Morocco to Iran, and astonishingly, he managed to not only maintain his people's independence for close to 2 decades, but he made significant gains against his mortal enemies, until he was finally defeated in 106 AD by the full might of Trajan's armies. As the Dacians had no known written sources of their own, very little is known of the early life of Decebalus. Just less than a century before, the lands of Dacia, as well as several neighbouring tribes of Thracians and Getae, had been unified under the strong rule of King Burebista, a strong ruler who himself had become an enemy of Caesar for a time shortly before his death. In the aftermath of Burebista's reign, his vast kingdom broke up once more into 5 separate states, all of which were forced to largely go on the defensive against the ever-encroaching power of Rome to the west. It was into one of these kingdoms, based in the Dacian heartlands around Scițyans, that Decebalus was born. Likely of noble birth, although very little is known about any of his family members, Decebalus spent his youth at the court of King Duras, possibly an uncle who at the time claimed authority over all of Dacia, and likely had ambitions to expand this territory to revive the legacy of Burebista's kingdom. Sensing that the time was right for war, and knowing that any territorial expansion would ultimately have to be won against the will of Rome, in 85 AD, Decebalus and his uncle marched their forces into the heavily fortified Roman border province of Moesia, just south of the Danube, harrying and burning the lands that they found there, likely in an attempt to gather more downtrodden people to their banners. Oppius Sabinus, the Roman governor of Moesia, was located and promptly killed, forcing the Emperor Domitian to personally travel to the troubled province to deal with the situation himself. The Dacians were apparently pushed back out of Moesia, but more than likely simply returned home after the successful campaign. Domitian then returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph in his own honour, leaving his general and prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Cornelius Fuscus, to lead 5 legions across the Danube to bring the Dacians under the heel of Rome once and for all. Fuscus made significant advances across the frontier, marching deep into Dacian territory at the head of his legions. All seemed well, until they finally reached a heavily forested area of impending cliff faces, now known as the Iron Gates of Transilvania. Fuscus ordered his men to march through the pass, which he knew would take them on into the Dacian heartlands. Before long, however, the unmistakable sound could be heard of thousands of projectile weapons descending upon the men from the cliffs above. It was a perfectly planned ambush, and in the ensuing fighting Fuscus was killed, along with the majority of 2 entire legions. The remaining Romans limped back to Moesia to lick their wounds, whilst Decebalus, the architect of the battle, was proclaimed the new king of Dacia, as the aging Duras abdicated in favour of the vigorous young warrior king. Fuscus was replaced by Tetius Julianus, and in 88 AD he led another campaign against the Dacians, this time defeating them in battle, but withdrawing before any significant gains could be made. Elsewhere in Europe, Domitian was forced to devote his attentions to other revolts along the Rhine and against the Sarmatians from the east. In dire need of the build-up of troops on the Dacian border, Domitian agreed terms with Decebalus, agreeing to pay large sums of money in tribute for maintaining the peace. Domitian even symbolically recognised Decebalus' sovereignty, representing him with a royal diadem. Although it wasn't a conclusive victory for either side, the outcome of the war was a great propaganda victory for the Dacians. In the aftermath of Domitian's Dacian War, Decebalus was able to significantly expand and consolidate his power. Neighbouring tribes flocked to his banner after hearing of his victories against the Romans, and he spent significant amounts of time seeking alliances with others. His court became a haven for the many enemies of the Romans, and his capital became a vast powerhouse, now defended by Roman fortifications and war machines supplied by Domitian under the terms of the truce. The situation remained the same for a decade, with Decebalus becoming one of the most powerful rulers on the borders of the empire. In 98 AD, however, a new emperor succeeded in Rome, and unfortunately for Decebalus and the Dacians, he was one of the greatest emperors and military leaders in history. Within 3 years of his coming to power, Trajan decided the only way to secure his borders was initially to expand them to encompass certain volatile elements. Dacia was first on his list, and in 101 AD he crossed over the border at the head of a huge force, well over 100,000 men in all. Decebalus sought terms but was rejected, finally opting to take on the Romans in a pitched battle at Tepe. The Dacians were defeated, but managed to inflict significant casualties upon the Romans, enough for Trajan to decide to fall back until he could renew the invasion in the spring. Capitalising upon this brief respite, Decebalus then crossed over the border into Moesia in a surprise attack. Himself being an expert tactician, Trajan repelled the attack, pushing the Dacians back at battle, and by early 102, despite intense resistance, he closed in on Scițyans, finally forcing the Dacians to terms. Decebalus was allowed to retain his throne, although he was forced to concede border territories to the Romans, and made to dismantle his fortress citadel. Of course, this was not the end of the Dacian wars, and as soon as he had built up his forces once more, as well as ensuring the help of numerous other neighbouring tribes, Decebalus launched a full-scale invasion of his former territories, hoping to claim them back from Trajan, who seems to have been taken entirely by surprise at this point. Knowing that to face the Romans in an open set-piece battle was suicide, Decebalus undertook a guerrilla campaign, harrying defences and chipping away at the defending forces on the border. He even attempted to have Trajan assassinated by using auxiliaries who had defected to his camp. All the while, Trajan spent his time building up his forces in preparation for his definitive invasion of Dacia. When the invasion finally came, it was one of the largest military expeditions ever yet undertaken. Taking no chances against the now veteran fighter of Rome, Trajan took with him as many as 200,000 men and marched directly upon the Dacian capital of Scițyans. Seeing the Roman response and realising the futility of resistance, most of Decebalus' allies abandoned him at this point, and after a few skirmishes and a long siege, the capital was sacked, burnt to the ground and destroyed entirely. Tens of thousands of Dacians were taken back to Rome as slaves to spend the rest of their lives labouring in miserable servitude or to die in the arena for the amusement of the crowd. Decebalus, having escaped with his family into the countryside, was finally tracked down some weeks later by Roman contingents scouring the area for him, and rather than be taken back to Rome as a trophy to be displayed during the inevitable triumphal parade which would follow the victory, Decebalus, the last king of Dacia, committed suicide. Trajan considered the Dacian Wars to be some of his greatest victories, and he had them commemorated in the triumphal display known as Trajan's Column, which can still be seen in Rome today. Decebalus later became a symbol of Romanian nationalism, and is still revered to this day. The Romans respected him to such an extent that a century later, the historian Cassius Dio had this to say about him. This man was shrewd in the understanding of warfare, and shrewd also in the waging of war. He judged well when to attack, and chose the right moment to retreat. He was an expert in ambuscades and a master in pitched battles, and he knew not only how to follow up a victory well, but also how to manage well a defeat. Hence he showed himself a worthy antagonist of the Romans for a long time.